Welcome once again to a check-in from Christchurch Cathedral, Victoria, BC, where we work, worship, and live on the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Lorna Williams, and with us also is Dr. Martha McGinnis, who I will now hand it over to take it from here.
Thank you, Ross. So I'm an associate professor at the University of Victoria and, as of July 1st, chair of the Department of Linguistics. At the Cathedral, I work with the Reverend Dr. Martin Brokenleg to co-chair the Conciliation think tank. Today, I am honored to be speaking with Dr. Lorna Williams, a member of the Lil'wat First Nation and professor emerita at the University of Victoria. Lorna has devoted her life to promoting and restoring Indigenous language and culture. She's worked as an Indigenous educator and language specialist in Indigenous communities, public schools, and adult education settings. At UVic, she was the first director of what is now the Indigenous Education Department and held a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Knowledge and Learning. She received the Order of BC in 1993 and the Order of Canada in 2019. In retirement, she's continued working hard and is currently a fellow of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. I know Lorna through her connection to UVic's linguistics department, where she's something of a legend, but I'm grateful to Ruth Dolander from Aboriginal Neighbours for inviting her to participate in this interview. So thank you for speaking with us, Lorna.
Thanks.
So I need to begin, of course, by acknowledging the news reports from the Kamloops and Cowessess First Nations about nearly 1,000 unmarked children's graves on the sites of former Indian residential schools. So I just wanted to ask you, what kind of effects are you seeing as a result of those reports?
Well, firstly, I think that the reports touched Indigenous people in that it brought back memories to many people who spent time in residential schools. It brought the pain back, I think, for people who, it's always there, but it brought it up to the forefront, knowing that there are children probably in every residential school. And so for us, it's a difficult time, but I think that the other thing that's happened that I can see is that many Canadians, not all yet, but many Canadians are educating themselves, learning, asking, wondering, and I think being free to be touched by the news in a way that I've not seen in anything else. And so I think that it was the right time. I guess the people were ready finally to be touched by it. I worked in advocacy for our people for most of my life, and knowing, for example, there's what the media has not talked about, and they refused to really cover the stories about Indigenous people in this country. And what I've seen in the last few weeks is a real shift. They're learning, and they're courageous enough to carry some stories that would never have been mentioned on air. And I think that probably it's because it's the younger people. I find that younger people today are much more willing to go to places that their parents wouldn't and didn't. And so I can see that that's a big change in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I also see, and because of my work, I'm in touch with people around the world, and the awareness of citizens around the world is about Canada and about what happened at residential schools, is really touching people. And, what happened here is not, didn't just happen here. And wherever colonization took place, it happened. Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What kinds of constructive actions do you think our cathedral community might be able to do to undertake to support justice for Indigenous people?
Well, one I think is learning. And you mentioned that you work with Dr. Martin Brokenleg, and you have an amazing teacher. And so if your congregation can learn and be willing to learn from the leadership of this man, that's a big step. And but it's not just about learning, it's also about action and addressing the injustice that has taken place by every Christian denomination and that was involved in residential schools. And so being willing and courageous enough to face that's part of your collective history is really important. And understanding, I think, and being willing to walk alongside the Indigenous peoples of this country in picking up the pieces and trying to put the pieces back together. There's, for example, there's a woman, I always use her quote, Angelina Stump from the North, and she said, "We're trying to put together a mirror that has been shattered into a million pieces." And that's a big task that we're undergoing, to try to put our lives back together, and in so many different ways, with the revitalization of our languages, the recovery of our languages in many cases, trying to to reconcile and to make sense of how our knowledge systems, our relationships with the land, with the Creator, with our spiritual lives, is really, it's something that we have to do. And it's really important that Canadians are willing to walk with us as we do this, not to lead us, but to walk with us and to support the efforts that we're making to put our lives back together.
Thank you. The Cathedral's monthly outreach donations for July are going to the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, whose mandate is to assist survivors with counseling and court support, information, referrals, workshops, and that sort of thing. Why is this kind of work important?
So although the last residential school closed in 1996, every family has been affected by residential schools. And it wasn't until the TRC and the work of Bobby Joseph and the residential schools office here that very much was done to support this people who were affected by residential schools. And so anything I think that people can do to support those services is of value, because what happened at residential schools and the experience that people had didn't affect just those generations. It affected many generations. And and those are still felt. And so any support that people can give because there's been very little. There's also been very little understanding by people who can provide those kinds of supports. And, you know, from the church, from the churches, from counseling, mental health, they're all learning too on how to support Indigenous people. It's a new area for many people, and people aren't prepared. People haven't been prepared educationally to support the Indigenous peoples who suffered from residential schools. And so any support, not just to provide it to the people, but to provide it to, you know, to the appropriate people who can actually help is important.
Thank you. So from your experience, what is the value of Indigenous education and language revitalization programs?
Well, the value of education is something that has been, you know, people know that education is important, learning is important. And education was also, you know, was very important to Indigenous people. And I can see it in how people were raised, people learned. The education system that was put into place, though, did a lot of harm. And because it denied people's history, it denied that there are other ways of learning. And the education system that was put into place is very hierarchical, status oriented, and also doesn't support that humans have a cognitive life, a feeling life, a physical life, and most importantly, a spiritual life. And what we've done in education is we've divided all those and said that only the intelligence, the cognition is of value. But in the Indigenous world, it's all of value. And so that's been really challenging in education. But having said all that, you know, in all my study, as I read, you know, reports, and from the very beginning of this country, the one that we now call Canada, in the discussions by Indigenous people, the Indigenous leaders that I've read from across Canada, they all talked about the importance of education. And so even though it has caused us much harm, people know its value. And so we as educators need to understand that and to do the work of learning and about what we've put into place. And I think that's happening. I think the education system needs to be able to figure out how to tell the story of Indigenous people and to tell history from a very different perspective than we have now. And we need to be able to prepare. You know, we both worked at an academic institution of higher learning, and we've done many good things, but we also have to have the courage and have the creativity to to be able to open society's eyes and ears and minds and hearts to the world of Indigenous people, and to know how education continues to be very damaging. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and insights, Lorna. Your work is truly inspired and truly inspiring. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you
No,
very much.
I want to thank you also. It's extremely helpful words for sharing those with us and with the world, really. And thank you also, Martha, for being here today to guide this conversation. And just again, my best wishes and blessings upon you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.